Thank you. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm certainly sorry that I can't be in person, and I'm sorry that Abbot Godwin isn't present today too. I'm Rabbi David Lyon. Just to let you know that I'm a resident of Houston. I have 4 grown children, a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law, a grandson. I've been the senior rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel for 18 years, but not a stranger to Houston. I began my rabbinate here 31 years ago. I've seen the city grow and change. Its needs, which are complex, be resolved through many different resources, including ISH and the role of rabbis, ministers, priests, imams, and many other faith leaders. So I'm grateful to be here today to address the subject, faith in the life and work of the therapist, turning the lens around. I'd like to present and share with you that I'll address 4 subject areas. First, context. Second, practice. Third, outlining needs. And fourth, some conclusions. It's important to set the context. As a rabbi, my context is Torah, but not only biblical text, also rabbinic. And from Torah and from rabbinic text, we find some early expectations for healing and healing the healer. Let's look first at Numbers chapter 12 and the story of Miriam and Moses. There, Miriam and her brother Aaron find themselves in some trouble for maligning their brother Moses. And as she is afflicted, her brother Moses prays on her behalf. In Hebrew, he says to God, El na rafana la, a beautiful alliterative prayer, also very brief and succinct. The translation often says, God, pray heal her. And the result is that she was healed. The community doesn't move on until she's completely healed. And in fact, we learn that she sat outside the camp for a number of days. But the camp doesn't continue until she rejoins them. So we learn immediately something about Moses' power to heal and the role of prayer that we say on someone's behalf, but also the role of healing that we as a community are only at our best when everybody is able to join us at their best. The expectation that the healer is heard and given response is present. It creates expectations that the healer can also heal himself. Moses' inevitable death that we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 31:14 says, your days are coming to an end. And suddenly Moses, who is the ultimate healer in the book of Numbers, finds himself unable necessarily to heal himself or to overcome his inevitable demise. So the tension is created for us, and we continue to unfold it. We also learn in Torah about the role of the high priest. In addition to Moses, who is the healer in Numbers, the high priest examines, heals, and reassembles the people. The high priest is functionally the doctor with no antibiotics or medicinal therapies, but rather trying to reason with and to understand God's ways as a source of blessing and a source of healing. The expectations for healing then come to the high priest and to Moses, and we discover that there is such ultimate expectation and hope placed in such hands that even today we might derive some expectation that the one who is ordained might also have some hope and some power to heal. But we're not misled. Ultimately, we also read in Psalms that God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. So ultimately, we also learn that Judaism does not ever misunderstand or mistake the role of the one who provides healing. If we're going to access healing, we can find it through the means of a rabbi, perhaps in the ancient times, the high priest, but ultimately the healing comes from the one who grants it, which is God. And in our own context, we'll discover that such healing from God can be a source of help and comfort too. So from biblical, we move to rabbinic. And by rabbinic, I mean post-biblical. So we discover in rabbinic teaching some important theology, so to speak, in Judaism. First of all, there are power to be found in deeds, which we call mitzvot. There are 613 commandments or mitzvot in the Torah and many more that are outlined in rabbinic thought. but they all lead to a specific end and purpose in Jewish life. We all know the word salvation, and salvation in Judaism is available through the doing of mitzvot. We call it personal salvation, so that we understand that some of the healing that we have to do is not by virtue of giving it over to someone else to do for us, but to accept the responsibility in relationship to God and to others for our own healing and our own wholeness. Over a lifetime, such salvation can be found. So much so that we expect, even on one's deathbed, the opportunity to do a mitzvah, to do a good deed, can be redemptive, healing. In rabbinic teaching, we also learn a special lesson. A master teaching his students explains that even one visit to an ill person can make a difference. He explains, every visit to an ill person removes 1/60th of the person's illness. A wise student went to his master and said, by that calculation, do we derive then that one could be healed completely with enough visits? The master said to his student, perhaps even anticipating the question, were it only so. And so the rabbinic teaching sets out for us our greatest hope, but also our greatest reality, ideal and practical at the same time. Hopeful that God can provide healing by virtue of our own role in visiting and making hopeful and helpful comments and prayers to such a person. But ultimately, what will be, the outcome is in God's hands. But we have a role to play. And even if it goes well beyond 60 visits, it's an ample amount. And we could also conclude that we've done our part in helping to heal the person who is seeking healing. We also discover that God's hope for us is not perfection, but it is becoming. We learn even at the high holy days, when we come to seek forgiveness, that the most precious things are not the most righteous among us. God actually welcomes those who have stumbled and fallen and doesn't seek to find great expectations from those who claim to be perfect or aim for it every day. God seeks forgiveness and is forgiven from each person. It is not the death of the sinner that God seeks, we learn, but that the sinner repent and return. Perfection is not the goal. It is becoming. And through the acts of salvation, we derive through mitzvot. Healing versus wholeness are two different things. And our purpose in our talk today is about healing power, not necessarily always being perfectly whole, and the ability and the comfort to live with that difference. I think it's highlighted perfectly by a 13th century poem written by the Jewish poet Abraham ben Samuel. He was writing in the midst of his despair in the 13th century, and he put it this way: I have tested the hearts of those who hate me, but no one hates me as my own heart does. Many are the blows and wounds inflicted by my enemies, but no one batters me and wounds me as my soul does. To whom can I cry out? Whom can I condemn when those who are destroying me come from within myself? I have found nothing better than to seek refuge in your mercy, God who sits upon the throne of mercy. It's a very powerful poem. Written in the 13th century, it could have been written yesterday, because it speaks about the familiar human spirit that is broken, seeking wholeness constantly. The poet doesn't linger in a world of his own misfortune. He ultimately leans on God more deeply when his ability to forgive himself fails. His insights lead him to new understanding. Forgiveness can't obliterate our memories of the past, but it can liberate us to move beyond them. And that's the insight of the story that I have learned for myself and shared with others. Likewise, Judaism is filled with folk stories on this same subject and topic. And there's a folk story, it's called The Most Precious Gift, very often told around Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when we seek spiritual healing, but really personal healing. It said that God's angels are sent to earth to find the most precious gift and to bring it back to God. And without telling you the entire story, as most stories are told in three parts, three angels go and find a precious gift and bring it to God, which is not the most precious gift and is unacceptable, until finally an angel sees a person who is crying, wailing, crying the tears of forgiveness and repentance to overcome that which he or she had done poorly, and through tears demonstrates sincerity, a genuine feeling of pain and remorse, and the hope to overcome it. The angel swoops down and grabs the tear from the repentant person and brings it back to God, who claims that this is the most precious gift. And therefore, we discover that those who are seeking the kind of healing or the power to overcome their previous failings might find through acts of forgiveness, even through emotional expression, that they are perhaps not healed completely, but surely forgiven, and to identify with their own human frailty, to discover that they don't have to be Moses or even a high priest. Likewise, even today, the ancient prayer we call Kaddish, many of you have heard it at the end of a Jewish funeral. It is actually not a prayer, but an ancient praise to God. It doesn't speak of death or sorrow or even salvation. But when we say it at the grave of the deceased, we lament what is lost, but in God's presence, we find comfort. But I've often used the Kaddish praise to offer to people to recite, perhaps at the funeral where there is estrangement or a lack of real love, but also in incidents of loss or failure in one's life, because it's by reciting the Kaddish that we also state that something is gone. I've never experienced the perfect love or the perfect hope or the perfect friendship. And when we feel a sense of loss, Kaddish can help us to know that it isn't only the deceased whom we mourn, but we also might mourn something that is gone from our life, or perhaps something that we may never possess. I found in people that reciting Kaddish for that reason too can be extraordinarily helpful, empowering, and healing. They let go, but find in God's presence something that they thought they couldn't find. We are not ultimate healers, and we are not Moses or the high priest. So I'll share with you a very special teaching in the Talmud. It's a story of a man named Zusia, who was so concerned that at the end of his life, that when God asked him about his deeds and evaluated his lifetime, that he might be asked, Zusia, why were you not as great as Moses? He was finally told that that's not the question he should be concerned about. The question he might be more concerned about before the end of his days is that he might be asked, why were you not the best Zusia that you could be? And that's the question that we can use as a framework in the healing resources that we provide ourselves, others, and those who provide healing too. It isn't to be the ultimate healer. It isn't to be Moses or the high priest. It isn't even to be as great as our own mentors in this field. But have we drawn the sustenance from our own practice, experience, and training to give what we can? So that is context. Now to practice. I'm grateful that some research has been done and was provided me in preparation for today. And in an article published by Joseph Picard in 2007 called Clergy as Mental Health Service Providers to Older Adults, it is true, as I learned from the study, and I can validate from my own experience, there is increased clergy contact among those with less social support and high attendance at worship services. Anecdotally, I can tell you that those who have fewer friends or fewer network connections, but higher attendance at worship services, discover that in hearing us, relating to us, sharing the worship experience with us, they inevitably discover that we are approachable, accessible, especially when we smile and greet them afterwards and catch up with them and wish them well in the new week. It might be the only contact that they have with somebody who listens intently and also wishes them well, unconditionally, without judgment or criticism. And so inevitably, we might get that phone call or email that says, "I'd like to see you." There's usually very little context within the email or even the phone call, so the visit is a surprise, but also a welcome invitation. So we sit and we learn from each other, and we help where we can, including to advocate for more attendance at worship services, not just to fill the seats, but to be sure that that sense of belonging and connection continues and deepens. Kenneth Flannelly and Rabbi Shira Stern also wrote an article, Rabbis and Health, a half-century review of the mental and physical healthcare literature from 1950 to 1999, validates what is also continually an experience that many rabbis and others in this field experience, that there is more collaboration between rabbis, psychologists, through referrals. It's a very important part of this healing work that we do. One of the essential lessons we learn even in rabbinical school, and I'll never forget it, is to acknowledge what we can do and the context from which we can provide healing, strength, and lessons, just as I've shared with you from Torah and rabbinic teachings, but to know our limits and boundaries. Even if we are told that we're effective, doesn't make us psychologists or psychiatrists or trained therapists. We are pastors in the role that we perform. So to have a Rolodex of sorts or contact lists to refer people to experts is essential. But I'll also share with you that very often when someone calls me for that consultation and pastoral visit with the rabbi, we are very often the last ones to be called. They're coming because of the association through worship services, but also because their therapist or psychologist said, it's time to see the rabbi for some spiritual guidance. So when they tell me that they've seen everybody and then me, I'm not surprised, I'm not disappointed or even insulted. But it is time now to interject the spiritual connection, that their feelings can be validated by me by helping them to connect to their own faith tradition and what it offers. For example, through practice, I remember vividly a woman who came to see me who was 70 or 75 years old. I was only about 50 at the time, and she still regarded me as the young rabbi who didn't have enough gray hair. But as she told me her story and the relationship she had still with her elderly mother, it was a mother-daughter relationship that had really not ever developed beyond perhaps the young 20s or even midlife. And so I said to this 70-year-old, as she outlined her story to me, that it was time to grow up. And when she looked at me with sort of a shocked look, I said, it's time to grow up because while you might have aggravated your mother as a teenager, she never stopped loving you. And at the age of 70, I'm sure she hasn't stopped loving you. And perhaps you haven't stopped aggravating her. But the relationship is intact. But it's certainly time for you to identify what is important to you. And in order to preserve the relationship, to exercise something else, which is to go back to the biblical teaching from the 10 Commandments. It says, honor your father and mother. It doesn't mean to obey by giving up your own hopes and dreams. It doesn't mean to bend over backwards to them. And since when you got married, your orientation was now to your spouse and not to your parents. You can thank them for advice, thank them for their love, but you were always entitled to make your own decisions respectfully. The conversation went exceedingly well. She was grateful that her own Judaism validated her needs, and she was able to approach her mother, even at this age and time in their respective lives, with courtesy and respect, but also the permission to do what she needed to do for herself and for her own immediate family. What we also face, especially in this pandemic time, is isolation and loneliness. Widows seek companionship. Others are lacking connectedness. Expectations of rabbis even to be matchmakers. I've had numerous requests from me to make a list for their son, their daughter, or even for themselves as they face loneliness, for me to match them up. I'm not a very good matchmaker, I can tell you, and I don't want to make my living at it. But I do help them to understand that sometimes when you stop looking so hard, somebody will come around the corner to greet you. Just as often as we run after happiness, sometimes when we slow down, it finds us. But grief is profound, and in an age of pandemic, it has been deepened and concentrated in the ways that people have not been able to find what they need. And so they come to us seeking some connection and a listening ear. The role of the rabbi then is to collaborate with them, to validate them, and also to refer them. But I try to bring to bear the responsibilities we have in covenant with God. Judaism is a covenantal faith tradition. And so it isn't only to give us what we need, but to take what God has already given and to use it in practice, to build ourselves up and to find our way with our family, our friends, and of course, ourselves. There is some limit setting that I find very helpful. It's the way I've guided congregants and others, but also other rabbis, and also those who are therapists to their patients. It's very important to focus on first what we need for ourselves without guilt. Rabbi Hillel taught, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? It's important in that manner to create what we call a shalom bayit, a peaceful house, peace in our own home, peace in our workplace, where we are the non-anxious presence that allows people to be heard, to be felt, and to be helped. And we also have to create shalom, or peace, within our marriage. We have to create the ways that conversation can be held without criticism or judgment. And sometimes just to listen without necessarily also aiding can be incredibly resourceful teaching. And we also have to limit ourselves in the ways that we help family or friends financially and emotionally. If we give ourselves up completely emotionally, we may be depleted by the end of the day or the week or the year, unable even to help ourselves, which would be a great tragedy. And financially, how often I have said to families that for children who are dependent or for those who are without the means that they need, there is just so much we can do. And I've suggested that for children, set a monthly limit. Let them fill in the gap with initiative, with sweat equity. And even for congregants or members of the community who come to me, I have funds that I can use to help them through an acute crisis, but not a chronic one. And when they come again and again for help, it's time to turn them over by referring them to larger community resources. All of this goes to say that we are more powerful than we think, but also not as powerful as we ever thought. So we have to outline some needs. How do we turn the lens on ourselves to be helpful to us so that we can be helpful to others? First, we have to practice what we preach. And I know that sounds simple and perhaps all too familiar, but the reality is that even as a rabbi who has lost a father, who has faced challenges in his life and has watched more tragedy, but also great happiness, far more than most 59-year-olds in my peer group, we grow up faster as clergy and as therapists because we see it all, we feel it all. And when we have to help others, we have to be sure that we're in the best position to do it. I love worship, and I urge those who come to see me not to avoid the role of worship. They might say, I'm not a religious Jew, or I can't pray when I'm leading prayer. I guide them not only to understand that Jews pray, and it isn't counterintuitive to attend services on Shabbat, and not just because I want them to be there, but also for rabbis who say that they can't pray when they're leading prayer. I would urge them to get the training and take the time that they need to discover how to pray when they're leading prayer. I love leading prayer from our pulpit. I love the singing and the music and when others are leading. I like to see the congregants whose eyes are either closed because they're taking the final rest that they need at the end of the day. I don't take it personally, even when they close their eyes during my sermon. But I enjoy reading the energy and to know at the end of the service that the hour we spent together was well taken. There's also a tradition in Judaism called Musar. It's about a 1,000-year-old resource of ethical teaching and ethical practice. Musar speaks of sacred daily practice, and certain values. I'll give you one that I think is extraordinarily important in this context. It's called in Hebrew, hakarat tov, and it means gratitude. It does not mean going about our day saying thank you, thank you, thank you to everybody and everything that happened to us, but rather to live with a sense of gratitude for what we've been given. It's extraordinarily healing for those of us who help others in healing, and for those who are therapists who help others heal too. To feel grateful for what we have, that half cup that is full rather than empty, and sometimes even overflowing, helps us to see that what is in front of us is a resource for good, for mitzvot. And what we're lacking at times is not a curse, it isn't an abandonment by God, but maybe even an opportunity to say, I'm grateful for what I still have, or I'm grateful for the opportunity to dig deeper into myself and discover what is already there, which I've never used or accessed because this experience hasn't come to me in the past. But gratitude also to know that we're not alone. There is the rabbi, there is the therapist, there are other resources available, and it isn't a sign of weakness to ask for help. Alternatively, it's really a sign of great strength. Isolation and loneliness, too, can affect us. I sit on the National Board of Reform Rabbis, and one of the major issues that we confront constantly is isolation in the clergy environment. I serve a large congregation. I have 2 rabbis who work under me and a cantor as well, and a large staff. It doesn't mean that there aren't moments of isolation, but all the more so for those who are truly living and working in smaller, medium-sized congregations outside the larger cities. What do? Thankfully, by means of technology, just like Zoom, we engage in what's called chavruta study and engagement. Chevra is a friendship group. And very often those friendship groups begin in rabbinical school, but they can also be created and originated through contact with others who are in similar positions. We break down barriers also to competition by listening to each other and helping each other. Ironically, you might think that the greatest level of competition is between lawyers or doctors or other high-level professionals. In reality, one of the highest levels of competition can be observed between clergy. Who gave a better sermon? Who serves a bigger pulpit? All of those questions sound ridiculous and incredibly juvenile, and in reality, they really are. But that's also a place and an origin of such competition, which can lead to loneliness, embarrassment, and a sense of failure at times. We can overcome it too by growing our competencies. I was once in charge of helping to develop for the CCAR a continuing rabbinic education program. Just as it's true for lawyers and doctors and therapists, very often in the clergy roles, there isn't an expectation for continuing rabbinic education requirements because the idea of study among rabbis seems obvious, but it isn't. I read constantly and been writing and studying, but to be expected to do it is a great incentive. Technology and social media are also great for breaking down isolation and loneliness, and we know it. But what's fundamental to it is something that we learned from our great rabbis. I want to quote from Rabbi Sam Karf of blessed memory. He wrote in his book, Permission to Believe, and something that I quoted in the eulogy that I prepared at his funeral. I wrote, before Sam led others, he led himself through junctures of his life and the rabbinate. Writing in his book, page 113 in that book, he came to a deep and personal conclusion. Here's what Sam Karf wrote. I am of worth, even though sometimes I mess up or fail, because I am created in the image of God. I have tasks to do. I should focus not on whether I will succeed or fail, but on doing the task I am intended to do with all my heart as an offering to my Creator. I must believe that if I do all I can, God, the Redeemer and Helper, will somehow sustain me. I wish I could read that again to you. Perhaps you'll find it in his book and take it to heart. By the way, Sam wrote those words when he woke up in the middle of the night and composed them because he himself, at an earlier age in his rabbinate, was suffering and struggling to know What was his worth? Where did he succeed? How will he fail? And where is the gap between success and failure? His faith in God as creator, as redeemer and helper would help to sustain him in the gap that he discovered in all that he did and sometimes struggled to do. I've witnessed colleagues who fall out of the rabbinate, who fail in their life's work to be a rabbi because they fail to nourish their own relationship to God and see themselves not as an ultimate healer, but as a human being who is uniquely prepared to do the task they are intended to do, as Sam Carf put it, and do those tasks as an offering to God. I think the word offering is an undervalued expression. Truthfully, our prayers replaced sacrifice when the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. But our offerings to God through prayer and practice are especially important when we wrap them in a sense of the sacred, a sense of the holy, and the sense of the greatest human desire we can offer to God through our help to others to be at their best. The role of offerings are prayers. God hears our prayers, and God doesn't deny the offering or the prayer. Jewish folk stories also tell us that in the act of repentance, God will meet us halfway, even more if it's necessary. So important is the role of repentance on our way to healing and hope that God will meet us so that we can continue to be the human beings that we were created to be, not immediately and not through an immediate act of salvation, but through salvation over the course of our lifetime. Some conclusions. So what has become of me when the lens has been turned on me, or when I've turned on myself? I want to share with you some advice that I've given to rabbis and those who are also in the role of healing as therapists, ministers, and other healers. First, I am only human, all of us, only human, created in the image of God, hopefully by participating in the sacred work, fulfilling something that God needs us to do and that is well received by those who are sitting before us. Also, I've listened to my needs, especially during this pandemic, and I have felt the need to step back, take a walk, go to bed, and to let my wife know that I'm hurting. And I've discovered, and without guilt, that when I did step back, when I took a walk, I went to bed and let my wife know that I'm hurting, I didn't fail to get the work done that I needed to do in the end. I actually was better prepared because I took care of myself. Remember that I quoted Hillel, who said, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me?" The second part of his statement was, "If I am only for myself, what am I?" And third, he said, "If not now, when?" My wife was most helpful to me, and I think we can be very helpful to others when we remember that to be heard and not fixed can be very essential for ourselves and for others. When my wife heard me and didn't try to fix me, I felt nourished. I felt helped because somebody acknowledged what I was going through. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that for others too. It helps to take down the expectations that we are going to be the ultimate fixer. But if we can be the ultimate listener, unconditionally and without judgment, then people feel safe in our company and perhaps even willing to come back. I've also learned that when somebody expects so much of me, I pause to break it down, to postpone and to schedule time when, as I've said to people, I can be fully available to you. I can't talk to you on Sunday night because I want to be fully available to you. Let's talk on Monday. Or I can't talk to you now because I will be interrupted, and that's not how I want to spend time with you. I want to spend time uninterrupted. Or I've said, after reading a very long email from somebody who's seeking my help through detailed stories and anecdotes of their experience, I say, "You've written me a thorough email. Let me absorb it in order to respond appropriately. May I get back to you in a couple of days?" Or when someone outlines for me years of pain and trauma, I've learned to say, you've had years of this trauma. May I have more than a day or an hour to consider your needs and how to help you? Very often, the response is, of course, Rabbi. I've lived with this all my life. I can't expect you to give me an immediate answer. And I'm very grateful for their reasonableness and the time to be more helpful. Effective helpers to rabbis and clergy is not to do therapy on us. I find that those who want to be helpful to me are more helpful when they say to me, how can I help you? Or what role can I play for you? I don't want to be therapized, so to speak. I don't want to be placed in a position that I'm not ready to step into. And I've discovered for myself through worship, through study, through connection with colleagues, through a loving relationship with my wife and my adoring family, I have what I need, and I don't lament what I don't. I may need more free time, but the truth is that a great day for me, a day off, is a good cup of coffee, a good chair, and a great book. And just a little time to do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day is such a thrill, and sometimes can be renewing and nourishing enough to say I have more time and energy for others too. For the rabbi who leads worship, teaches texts, and counsels well-being, the rabbi must pray and study and provide self-care. So as I've said, I love worship services. I always have. I love to read and study not just Judaism. In fact, right now I'm finishing a book on World War II and the role of Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt, and Stalin. And to read about English history and the history of World War II takes my mind away, but also enriches my understanding of the world around me. Self-care is important. I do go to the gym. I don't have great hobbies. I don't have a boat. I don't run, but I enjoy going to the gym so that I can keep up my strength. And frankly, someone asked me why, so that I can lift the Torah out of the Holy Ark without hurting my back. They can be heavy with responsibility, and physically heavy too. So there are a lot of things to think about, but I never fail to consider myself only as a human being who simply has a lot of responsibility. I bring my offerings faithfully. I hone my art and my craft, and I'm grateful for what I can do and be. And within the human limits I've described, I would put it in a quick formula: prepare, study, validate through authentic representation of faith for the sake of human needs, and refer for professional counsel. And then repeat, do it all over again. Somebody once said to me that at the end of our days, as we face our mortality, we may not be cured, but we may be healed. I think it's an important concept to help others to know that they might not be cured of any of the distress or cured of any of the ailing that they encounter, but we might be healed from it in order to forgive ourselves, to forgive others, to know that we've been heard and helped along the way, and that the process of salvation is not immediate, but it can take the course of a lifetime, a journey that we encounter not alone, but in the company of others. If we can be a part of that process in the roles that we play, and if I can be helpful to congregants or members of the community or therapists who come to find help from me, then that is a pleasure. And when I'm ready, I might ask for more help too when I need it. Right now, I would just say from time to time that I'm depleted or exhausted, but not without means to replenish, to nourish myself, and to find the spirit that I need through wonderful examples of the human resilience to overcome some terrible times and difficulties through faith, through study, through connection and friendship. I want to thank you for inviting me today to be with you. I hope that some of what I was able to provide from a rabbinic and a congregational point of view might be helpful to you now and in the future. Many thanks.